Green and sustainable bonds are financial products that aim to fund projects which have a positive effect on the climate, on the environment, and on our society. The first green bond was issued by the European Investment Bank almost exactly 15 years ago to the day today, in July 2007. Since then, the market for green bonds has increased dramatically, with the Climate Bonds Initiative estimating the average annual growth rate for this type of issuances at approximately 95%. To explore the reasons for this extraordinary market uptake of green bonds and sustainability-linked bonds, and to analyze the trends, risks, and opportunities of this whole new world of financial products, the Florence School of Banking and Finance is organizing a training course entitled Green Bonds and the Sustainable Bond Market. The course will take place online and in Florence, Italy in September 2022. But now let's go back with our minds to that first green bond issuance 15 years ago by the European Investment Bank. Today, the EIB is the largest multilateral development bank issuer of green, social and sustainable bonds, with issues totaling over 60 billion euros in 22 different currencies. It is a pleasure today for me to be right in front of the mastermind of the first financial operation by the EIB, Mr. Aldo Romani, Head of Sustainability Funding at the EIB. Aldo, it is a pleasure to have you here in Florence.
Thank you very much, Jan. It is a pleasure to be here too. And thank you very much for this nice introduction.
Thank you very much, Aldo, and very glad to have you here. As I mentioned, you are behind the first green bond issued by the EIB in 2007 and also behind the EIB's first sustainability bond in 2018. And furthermore, in the same year, you were also nominated the Green Bond Personality of the Year by Environmental Finance. So first of all, congratulations for this achievement. Could you explain to our listeners what is today your role at the EIB, and generally, what are your activities within the green bond panorama?
Well, as you said, from the very beginning, I have been in charge of issuing this type of bonds and was instrumental in the conceptual development of this concept at the very origin of the green bond market. But at the same time, I have been a person that has been confronted with a number of challenges that these products have generated, and has tackled the issues in a very pragmatic manner from the point of view of a practitioner. So this extends from the build-up of the administration that is required to deliver on the promise that we make to investors when we offer them these bonds, to the development of the other aspects that in the course of time have shown to be important in this context. External verification, for example, is one issue that we have started tackling in 2016. It's essential in providing reliability to the information that is communicated to investors. From 2016 onwards, the intervention of public authorities in the enhancement of clarity in sustainable finance has led to a number of other opportunities of initiative that I have tackled, and that the EIB has dedicated relevance to with the creation of the area of sustainability funding, which in the Capital Markets Department is in charge of the issuance of climate and sustainability awareness bonds. So I would say that in a way I personificate the various phases of development of this market, the importance of which has been growing over time.
And I also wanted to mention here that you're also visiting today us in Florence in the capacity of being an instructor in the upcoming course entitled Green Bonds and the Sustainable Bond Market, and we thank you very much for your availability in this activity as well. But going back to the EIB, today the EIB has really an impressive track record in the issuances of green, social and sustainable bonds. So looking back at the bank's history, what were, in your opinion, the factors that brought to this huge development of green bonds over the course of the past decade?
Well, at the very beginning, the issue was one of cross-fertilization. The first green bond is a typical example of cross-fertilization because the first green bond was also the first to be offered publicly also to retail investors in all domestic markets of the European Union. And that was in fact a primary objective of the first transaction that made use of the passporting mechanism of the Prospectus Directive as a way to simplify distribution across the Union. So giving substance to Capital Markets Union via European legislation. In the course of time, other aspects have come to create or to came to the foreground because initially there was a focus on the monitoring of the actual disbursements to eligible projects. From 2013 onwards, the subject of clarity in green finance came to play an increasing role because investors wanted to have more information about the impact coming from the use of their funds. This in turn led to an increasing attention to the constituents of that component, which pertain to impact reporting, which pertain to the definition itself of what is sustainable, and led eventually to also the intervention of public authorities in this field and to the legislative developments that we have witnessed in the past years. This has led to other forms of cross-fertilization that have highlighted how important capital markets are in pursuing important objectives like sustainable development for European integration in the first place.
So looking back with our minds at that first issuance in 2007, some commentators report that at that time the market was somehow being dubious about this type of products. As a person who has been involved in this type of issuances since its very first steps, what was your feeling at that time and how did you see the market change in the subsequent years?
Well, clearly, there was a great interest for this first transaction back then. I remember that when we announced this initiative, there was really an enormous attention from the press. We recorded more than 200 articles focusing on this initiative. But definitely there was also skepticism as to the possibility to offer a product to investors that would really change the way in which investors consider sustainable investment. Myself, I must say, was had a quite ingenious idea of what a sustainable investor is and thought that an ideal type of sustainable investors would exist. The transaction revealed, in fact, a high degree of fragmentation and a very, very strong attention to communication around sustainability, but the impossibility to provide a kind of a coherent view. So this made, of course, the development of this market difficult because in absence of a unitary framework of reference, a unitary set of definitions, and a univocal definition of what a sustainable investor is like, it is impossible also to develop the supply that we were hoping.
Right. And looking at this evolution, the evolution of the market was indeed affected by also changes in regulation, which include predominantly actions by European institutions in the European field. So could you highlight also the major regulatory changes that took place over the course of the past years and describe how they impacted on the market and on the considerations you just made?
Yes. Well, definitely. The market started to develop in a more systematic manner from 2013 onwards, after the financial crisis. Clearly, there was an increased attention from all market participants that had a kind of a strategic look at market potential to these aspects. And this led to a more systematic approach, both on the side of investors at this point and of intermediaries to the subject. The market started to give itself certain rules, and this led to the creation of the green bond principles, which put around the table issuers, investors, and intermediaries in the attempt to define what is essential in a green bond. But very soon, this kind of definition of the basic rules of the game came to a kind of a deadlock, in the sense that in order to create a platform for the whole market, you inevitably need to be quite general as to the definition of what is eligible. So this led eventually to the intervention of policymakers that realized the relevance, the potential relevance of this market for the enhancement of the accountability of sustainable finance, recognized capital markets as an interlocutor of primary importance, and started to intervene in the reform of sustainable finance by legislative processes. This is something that started in China at the end of 2015, but basically was generalized as approach in the context of the G20. And the European Commission in particular intervened in September 2016, indicating its desire to act accordingly and achieve that degree of precision and operationalization that would promote the better functioning of the markets. This is a process that has continued in a very dynamic way in the dialogue between markets and other constituencies and the policymakers, and has led in particular to the entry into force of the taxonomy regulation in July 2020.
Looking at one of the actors that we mentioned before, the EIB, in late 2019, the board of directors at the EIB had outlined a strategy to increase the levels of climate and environment commitment for the bank, effectively transforming the EIB into the EU climate bank. This decision naturally had an effect on green and sustainable bonds. In fact, looking at the numbers, 2021, as we discussed before, was a record year for the issuances of this type of products. So where do you see that the bank is going in the future within this field?
Well, the bank has taken a very systematic approach to its operational strategy on both the lending and the funding side, which operate nowadays in the new regulatory framework within under the umbrella of a single set of definitions and a single framework of reference, the taxonomy regulation as mentioned. Very concretely, in its climate bank roadmap, the EIB committed to important objectives in this area. The idea that it will enlarge the portion of green finance to at least 50% of new loan signatures per year by 2025, by indicating that the tracking methodology for green finance would be developed in order to align with the framework established by the taxonomy regulation, and by indicating also that the scope of climate and sustainability wellness bonds would be gradually extended to reflect this process to capital markets in a transparent manner. I also have to mention here that in anticipation of this kind of development, already in at the end of 2018, the EIB decided to link the allocations of its climate and sustainability awareness bonds to evolving legislation on sustainable finance, establishing therefore a direct link to this process. As a matter of fact, we have now a business model in place according to which there will be a concomitant development of the application of the taxonomy regulation to the lending side of the bank, and the volumes of eligible disbursements that it will be possible to allocate from CAP and SAB issuance. Therefore, extending gradually the volume of issuance, which, by the way, has come in the past few years from 7% in 2019 to roughly 30% of issuance already this year.
Now, those numbers clearly say that sustainable bonds and green bonds are a success story, but also looking at this field more critically, this evolution in the market may bring along naturally a set of different challenges. So what would you describe as the biggest challenges for this type of products in the coming years in the future?
Well, clearly, in order to have markets work properly, this process needs to extend to a maximum number of actors and a maximum number of activities. And it is not an easy process. As you know, the process of consultation that the European Commission kickstarted back in 2016 has produced the first taxonomy for climate only for entry into force at the beginning of this year. The criteria that are being developed, the technical screening criteria for other environmental objectives are still in the making. So it is clearly a gradual process that will also require a calibration with the input from the market that is needed. And so this is definitely a process that will take time. It will take time to implement. And it is also a process that is changing the landscape as we go. So this produces challenges in terms of gradually adapting to these changes that needs to be managed in a strategic manner. So at the same time, I would like to highlight that every challenge is also an opportunity. It is an opportunity because this system de facto gives indeed the capital market participants to give their opinion on the subjects that are being addressed. Because it does so in a way that reduces the uncertainties that market actors were facing so far. This enables the market to deploy its whole strength at the service of an improvement of the situation over time.
And on that positive note, I would like to conclude with the final question for today's podcast, and that's regarding capital markets. Here in the EU, we're still building the Capital Markets Union. And how do you think that green and sustainable bond issuances are affecting the development of capital markets in the EU and also beyond? And how do you think that this type of impact is playing out in the other way around? So capital markets affecting green sustainable bonds and green sustainable bonds affecting capital markets.
Yeah, this is a very good question because it takes really to the essence of what we are witnessing. First of all, it is clear that the European Commission sees capital markets at the center of this process. It is DG FISMA that has taken the leadership and the coordination of this clarification process. And the core idea is that markets must be put in the condition to work better at the service of sustainability. How do you want to have fair competition if each individual jurisdiction participating in the internal market has the possibility to define on its own what is sustainable or not? How do you want to have effectiveness in the role of capital markets in promoting this development if you do not provide a single set of definitions along the investment chain? In the end, the idea is to facilitate sustainable investment, thereby putting sustainable investment in the driving chair, not only in terms of provision of capital, but also in terms of clarification as to where that capital should be best deployed. So this is a core idea that reflects very much the way in which the European Union works. Sustainable development is clearly a major objective of European integration, but it is the market, the internal market and capital markets in the first place, which move faster and on the basis of expectations, that is the core instrument in the pursuit of policy objectives. So if you accept this idea, you also recognize that markets are the best instrument to synthesize information and can provide the best contribution to this kind of development. It is not just something that applies to Europe, because if you see this type of regulation as defining the rules of the game, which, by the way, the Commission has the power to implement at national level via regulation exactly because it is in charge of competition, you also establish a touchstone that provides a useful reference also for all those market participants in the other parts of the world that are looking at this kind of approach as a reference, not so much in terms of taxonomy, which may differ locally, but especially in terms of the legislative approach that permits to clarify better with reference to a single language and a single set of indicators how individual strategies reflecting individual circumstances locally compare with each other. And this is a recipe, indeed, also for facilitating capital flows, for example, from the developed to the non-developed part of the world.
Indeed, I very much liked it to extend the horizon from the EU to the other parts of the world. So that's precisely what I wanted to ask you next. How do you think that the international green debt market will evolve, and which will be the major players in the field? We're talking about the US, China, or emerging markets. So what's your forecast for the future here?
Well, clearly, Europe and China have been already collaborating in this field. We at the EIB already started a dialogue back in 2017 in the attempt to establish a concrete basis for discussion and a shared approach to the subject by comparing the definitions used by the MDBs in the area of climate change mitigation, for example, and the taxonomy that China had established by law at the end of 2015. And we derived a number of market-driven considerations that we let flow into the consultative process in Europe. This has continued and continues today in the context of the so-called International Platform on Sustainable Finance that sees China and Europe and the European Commission co-chair a group that is developing an analysis of the possibility of a common ground taxonomy. At the same time, one has to say that China co-chairs the Sustainable Finance Working Group of the G20, together with the US. And the US has shown also an increasing interest for this kind of approach in terms of at least reference for discussion. I hope very much that the concrete advantages that this kind of market-driven simplification and focus on essential aspects that can be structured in a kind of a shared way using a common language for easy use, easy verification, and easy comparison may show all of its advantages to markets in the course of time and therefore lead to an increased level of comparability over time.
And remaining still on the international level, where do you think that multilateral development banks fit in this scenario, in the future evolution of green and sustainable bonds markets?
Well, clearly, multilateral development banks here would have, for example, the function of clarifying at local level how individual parameters should be declined, should be decleansed, and provide a kind of a seal of approval for the decisions that are made locally within the context of a standard neutral classification approach that, you know, the policymakers share, but they can be interpreted in different ways depending on the individual circumstances of the local countries. So again, the multilateral development banks, also thanks to the impartiality of their granted by their multilateral approach, would be in a better position to assess these aspects locally and therefore fluidificating and helping this new system to work with the degree of credibility that markets need in order to operate efficiently.
Mr. Romani, thank you very much for having provided this overview, also on the international side, and generally for your remarks. Today we have, unfortunately, a limited time frame, but you have raised many important points which really helped us to shed a light on the panorama of green bonds today, and also looking forward at how would the future unfold. But this coming September, there will be more occasions to continue this conversation and to go more also in the details on each one of the topics that you mentioned in the occasion of the course on green bonds and sustainable bond market. The course will start on the 5th of September and will finish up on the 30th of September with a session here at the European University Institute in Florence between the 21st and the 23rd of September. And we look forward to seeing you and all the other instructors and participants here in Florence again in that occasion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to coming to Florence again.
Great. Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you for having listened to this podcast by the Florence School of Banking and Finance. For more information and to listen to all our podcasts, visit the webpage fbf.eui.eu.